When you've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, it can be both relieving and cause a great deal of anxiety. You finally have a label, a diagnosis for all of these confusing behaviors and upsetting events that have been happening in your life. On the flip side, now you are confronted with having to solve and manage these behaviors that have been wrapped up in this diagnosis, borderline personality disorder. Even the name itself, borderline personality disorder, has a great emotional weight to it. It sounds scary. You know, people are like, well, what are you on the borderline of? Psychosis, neurosis, what is it? Well, first, let me tell you that there is a lot of push over the last several years to change the name of borderline personality disorder to emotional regulation disorder. Experts and therapists have advocated that perhaps borderline personality disorder is closely related to CPTSD, which is known as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which kind of explains itself what it is. Instead of one upsetting traumatic event, you have several, making it complex, which is, I think, a good way to describe your relationships growing up, perhaps, or a traumatic event. At least in my case, it was. So today, I want to talk a little bit about what happens when you've been diagnosed. Where should you go from there? I will cover all of the different feelings, emotions, thoughts, consequences, actions that come along with getting that diagnosis, and I'm going to share my story. So before we get started, I am Jen. Welcome. This is BPD Woman. If you're tuning back in, thank you so much for keeping with us. If you are new to the channel, thank you. Please consider hitting like or subscribe. Always, please leave a comment. I love to hear your comments. And I am Jennifer, and I have been diagnosed. I was diagnosed about 20 years ago with BPD, and I've had a lot of ups and downs, but mostly progressively it's been a steady upward trend. And here we go. Just to preface, as always, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a licensed therapist, but I am someone who's lived with the disorder for 20 years, and I think that makes me somewhat of a quasi-expert. You be the judge. So I'll be looking at some notes here. Let me start briefly, and hopefully I can actually keep to brief, about my story of how I got diagnosed. I will say that I have the pretty textbook upbringing that you'll normally find described in the explanation for why do people get borderline personality disorder. Now, I won't read through all the criterion in the DSM-5 of what BPD is, but I can tell you that I suffered mainly from the following: self-harm, cutting, self-mutilation, violent, angry outbursts or inability to manage uncontrollable or unexpected anger. I definitely had issues with impulse control, namely dealing with substances, addictions to alcohol and drugs, mostly alcohol and cigarettes. Splitting thinking, black and white, you go from zero to hero in my book. And frequent attempts at trying to avoid abandonment. And that's like a big word that really describes things like, when we talk about, I'm actually going to write this down maybe for another video. When we talk about describing the DSM criteria and how that actually looks in behavior. Okay, cool. Frequent attempts to flee abandonment for me look like constant texting, asking people if they're angry with me, obsessing whether someone will stay in my life, catastrophizing that someone's going to leave me, which leads into its own cycle of doing behaviors that actually, unfortunately, lead to that outcome because I've pushed someone away. So first I want to say that no matter what in your diagnosis, you're a human being, okay? And not everything in your life is explained by the fact that you have borderline personality disorder, okay? I used to date someone, and it can be easy to think that way, especially if you have black and white thinking, but I used to date someone and he used to say, Jen, don't forget the human factor, which means, if I was really upset about something, I would be like, oh, I'm being too emotional. This is definitely because of my BPD, when actually, any other human suffering through that particularly upsetting incident would be going through the same thing. Having problems at work, having problems with money or budgeting money, those can't all be explained by having borderline personality disorder. Because if they did, if everyone who had a problem with work or a problem with money or a problem in their relationship, we would all have borderline. Okay? So, all borderline it's a kind of a deviation from adaptive behavior into kind of maladaptive behavior. So it doesn't mean that you don't experience the same things that other people do. All it means is that you experience things a little bit more intensely for a little bit longer. So I liken it to having emotional fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia is a disorder where people's immune systems, their nerves overreact, and so they feel this constant feeling of pain and discomfort. But doctors can't always tell you where that pain is coming from, but the people that have it are definitely suffering from it. So, for me, I liken it to if it's raining on you, it's a hurricane and on me. All right, so let's give some background. I grew up as an only child with two very volatile parents. One of them tried to kill the other one when I was about 4 years old. I witnessed that. I witnessed my mother's drug overdoses, suicide attempts. I witnessed my father's beatings. I witnessed this pretty regularly from birth to my first probably real solid memory started around 3 or 4, witnessing this abuse. At around 5 years old, and I was, of course, not spared. Growing up in this environment, it was completely chaotic, terrifying. When you grow up, you expect your parents to provide your support and safety. And if you don't feel those at home, well, yikes. And I didn't. So I often grew up very afraid. I remember being in kindergarten and crying uncontrollably in class, and my teacher would have to call my mother, and my mother would appear normal on the phone. My father would appear sane in person. But I now believe that my mother was borderline. This is primarily because she told me she was. And my father was narcissistic, and you'll find that narcissistic borderline relationships are actually pretty common because they're pretty opposite. One's a giver, one's a taker. One's an empathizer, one is all about them, little empathy. One is a people pleaser, the other one wants everything their way. So you can see how that would work. So needless to say, I grew up also with a very sexually inappropriate father who, through his jokes, comments, poor physical boundaries, made it known that he was a misogynist. Some of them are very disturbing. I had a grandmother. As I said, I was an only child. I had a grandmother, and I think without having that grandmother presence in my life, that very stabilizing force in my life, I think my life would have turned out a lot different. So I was very lucky there. Between the ages of about 5 and 12, my parents fought each other in court for custody. There were frequent games or competitions between the two, holidays. I did a video, check it out, on holidays, and having BPD, and holidays were often fraught with guilt, feelings of guilt, because if I liked one present that one person gave me, then I would be betraying the other parent, right? Like if one person bought me a Polaroid camera, the other person bought me, a boombox. If one person bought me a scooter, the other one bought me a bike, so I couldn't even enjoy these things because enjoying one would, betray the other parent. That's a super shitty position to put your kid in, okay? And growing up, I was in and out of therapy. My mother was in and out of hospitals. My mother put me into hospital stays, psychiatric hospital stays back then, and this is in the mid to late 80s. Insurance companies operate a lot different then. And I remember I was in one of these institutions or these clinics for 30 days. And that's, these days you're lucky if they keep you longer than 4 or 5 days. So, or not lucky, whatever the case may be. So by the time of puberty, my mother was frequently increasing her drug and alcohol use. Prescription pills were mainly her thing. She missed a lot of work. She kept the blinds closed. She had a second husband. They divorced. My father had a second wife. They divorced. And in one instance, the second wife pushed me, and my father beat her in front of me. Neither of them were obviously fucking right? So, my mother, at a very crucial point when I was about 13 years old, called out of work and told her employer that the reason she had called out of work is because that I was having surgery. Later that evening, unbeknownst to me, it was about 4 p.m. I had come home from work. I was downstairs watching TV. My mother, again, was in her bedroom, doors closed, in a depressive state. And this employer called, and I answered the phone. And they said, well, what are you doing there? How was your surgery? And I was immediately caught off guard. But at 11 years old, I was like, oh, I'll play along. And I was like, oh, it was good. Yeah, I'm fine. I'll get my mother. Well, clearly, the employer found out that was all a lie, and my mother was fired. And my mother blamed that on me. So she kicked me out of the house. And I'll never forget that at 12 years old, I had the mind to say, well, if you kick me out, I am never coming back. So this was in my 8th grade year of school. I continued to live at school. At 13, I moved in with my father near his mom, which again was a good plus for me, having this grandmother, this stabilizing force in my life. And I lived with him from 13 to 18 until I went to school. And at that time, the sexual inappropriate behavior, innuendo, comments, leering at my body, talking to me about inappropriate things, finding his pornography, that continued. And that had an indelible effect on me, for sure. And again, I was continuing to live in an unsafe, unpredictable environment. He was prone to violent outbursts. There was one incident where I was getting ready to take a bath, and he had gotten pissed, and he broke down the bathroom door, and I was sitting there by the tub, literally shaking. Still had my clothes on, but what if I fucking hadn't, right? So I went to college at 18 years old. I was like, finally, I'm out of here. And I went to college for 3 years. And that time, I really, now that I was out of that environment, I was very confused. I was, pursuing a degree in theater and acting. I was alone. I had never really had the ability to keep or maintain friends, not only because of not only of my emotional dysregulation, but also because who wants to send their kid over to that volatile household, right? So I had a hard time making friends. That didn't get any better when I got to college. I had a few, but I felt like I was in an existential crisis. I remember like asking my teachers, why are we here on Earth? What is this about? and I became very emotional, and the crying outbursts and the mood swings, they continued, and I had never had a drink before in my life. And then I was 19 years old, and I remember having a drink and saying, well, I don't like how this tastes, but I want to get drunk. And so I drank all 6, and boom, there were the seeds of my addiction. So fast forward, I am now with, I'm on vacation in my junior year of college. I have no idea how I'm going to survive. Excuse me. Don't do that. Not right now. Thank you. Sorry. I have no idea how I'm going to survive. What am I going to do? Like, I don't know how to manage myself in New York City. Like, what the heck? And I was on a vacation with my friend from college, and I met a guy, and he was a nice guy. And so after probably more of me pushing, I moved in with him. And this was in a totally different state. I moved from Ohio to the South Carolina, Georgia border. I moved far. And I remember, okay, here's what frequent attempts to avoid abandonment looks like in motion. I remember that I could tell that our relationship wasn't going very well, and we had a lot of long distance phone calls. And I remember that I could feel him kind of drifting away on our texts and there wasn't texting back then. We didn't have cell phones yet, or not very sophisticated ones. And I could sense that he was pulling away from me. And so I got in my car late one night with my dog, and I drove down to South Carolina. And that's like a 16, 17-hour drive, or I forget, but it was a long drive. And he wasn't even home. He didn't even know I was coming, but I got in his apartment complex, and I sat down at his front door. And he was good. He was, he's happy to see me. But basically, I just never left after that. And so he helped me pack up my stuff, and then I moved in with him. And so we were together 3 years. And in this 3-year period, a lot of really bad stuff started to happen. My alcohol use and drinking really started to pick up. I was physically cutting myself. One time I cut my arm so bad I needed 12 stitches. I was physically abusing my boyfriend. I was punching him. We had many verbal altercations, mostly because of me and my alcohol use. I eventually was arrested. He didn't want me to be arrested. In fact, I called the police that day. They came, they took me, and he was in tears. And, it was a real downward spiral. And I'll tell you, spending that night in jail made me never want to spend another night in jail ever again. And I never have. I've never been arrested. I've never gotten into trouble like that again. Shortly around, or during, right around this period, 9/11 happens, right? So you take this really volatile situation and that I was going through, and you add on for those of you watching, I'm 41 years old. So I was 20 when 9/11 happened, 1920. So I have a very clear recollection of watching the towers fall over and over and over again on TV. And subsequently in my life, I've known first responders, people who survived attacks at the Pentagon in New York City. So maybe some of you actually will remember this happening in your lifetime, but for those of you who don't, it was one of the most cataclysmic events in this nation's history. And it was a fear that penetrated everyone because we were caught off guard. The sophistication of the attack, however simple it was so completely devastating. No one could have imagined what would happen. And from there, I spiraled further. And my boyfriend at the time, he was a volunteer firefighter. And so, 343 firefighters died. And so, it really touched home. And I don't know how I found myself there. I don't know if it was because I can't remember how I got to this hospital. But I remember clearly that I want to say like the police took me. Hey, stop. The police took me, and I remember that day sitting down at a table in a psych ward, feeling a bit calmer. And they slid me this little pamphlet, what is BPD? And it was bright orange, and they slipped it to me. And I was like, oh my God. They were like, have you ever heard of BPD? And I was like, no, what's that? But all of those criteria matched me to a T, for sure. So I felt a big sense of relief because I was like, oh my God, like, yes, this is me. This is what's going on. It was nice to have a diagnosis, you know. I was relieved. I felt, okay, great. Now we'll fix it, you know. This will be easy. So let's stop right there, and I'll continue on with the part 2 so I don't make these videos super long. Okay, part 2 coming up soon.